The courtroom air was thick enough to choke on. The audience had seen arrogance before, but never like this. Karen Blake, a 42-year-old pet store owner from suburban Nevada, stood before Judge Judy Scheinlin with the kind of confidence that comes only from years of getting her own way. Her manicured nails tapped against the courtroom table as if the entire proceeding were an inconvenience. Leashed beside her was a German shepherd, muscular, restless, eyes darting between the lights and the crowd. The dog's tension mirrored hers, edgy, proud, barely contained. Nobody yet knew that within seconds, that leash would fly through the air and television history would be made. Judge Judy's courtroom had witnessed thousands of disputes, from broken leases to family betrayals, but never a moment like this one. The case on paper was minor, a neighbor dispute about a dog attack and emotional damages. The plaintiff, Linda Morales, a 68-year-old retired teacher, claimed that Karen's dog had mauled her smaller terrier and left her with hospital bills and trauma. Karen wasn't just defending herself, she had countersued Linda for defamation and psychological harassment. To the viewers tuning in, it looked like a simple case about a dog fight. But beneath the surface was something far more volatile, a collision between entitlement and accountability. From the moment Karen opened her mouth, every warning bell in Judge Judy's mind went off. "Your Honor, let's get one thing straight," Karen began, her voice carrying that deadly mix of sugar and venom. "I'm not some reckless dog owner. I train German shepherds for discipline and protection. If Mrs. Morales and her rat dog had any sense, they would have kept their distance." The audience gasped. Judge Judy tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing to razor points. She had met hundreds of Karens in her career, but few this brazen. Linda's hands trembled as she held up a vet report, explaining how her terrier had needed 12 stitches. "All I wanted was an apology," she said softly. She laughed at me. That small sentence shifted the energy in the room. The audience leaned forward, even the bailiff's eyes tightened. Judge Judy noticed how Karen's expression barely changed. No remorse, no shock, only irritation that she had to listen to this. When Judy asked her to respond, Karen snapped, "Maybe if she could control her toy dog, mine wouldn't need to remind it who's alpha." The room went dead silent. Even the dog let out a low rumble as if punctuating the insult. Judge Judy took a measured breath. Her voice was flat, cold. "Miss Blake, that is not how civilized people speak in my courtroom. Control yourself and control your animal." Karen smirked as if she had won a round. That smirk would become her undoing. She rolled her eyes so hard that the camera zoomed in instinctively, catching the exact moment viewers would later replay millions of times. "Judge, I run a business that helps people train animals. I think I know a little more than you about dog psychology." She tugged on the leash for emphasis. The shepherd barked once, sharp and warning. The bailiff instinctively stepped closer. Judy's gaze did not flicker. What the audience didn't know was that Judge Judy had already done her homework. Her team had pulled animal control records showing 3 prior complaints against Karen's dog for aggressive behavior. 2 neighbors had filed police reports after verbal threats. The judge knew exactly what kind of person she was dealing with, someone who confused dominance with strength and fear with respect. So she let Karen dig her own grave. Each answer, each sarcastic remark, became a shovel stroke deeper into the pit she was building for herself. "Tell me," Judy said, leaning forward slightly, "if you train for discipline, why does your dog seem more nervous than trained?" The tone was bait and Karen took it. "My dog's fine," she snapped. "He just doesn't like loud, judgmental women screaming at him." The gasps from the audience rolled like thunder. Even Karen's dog flinched as if sensing the incoming storm. Judge Judy slowly removed her glasses, folded them, and placed them on the bench, a gesture that longtime viewers knew meant one thing: the execution was imminent. But instead of exploding, she spoke quietly, each word a measured cut. "You are one sentence away from learning the difference between confidence and contempt. Choose your next words carefully." It should have been a warning. It was an invitation to disaster. Karen laughed, a short, sharp sound that sliced through the tension like broken glass. "Honestly, Judge, I don't have time for this drama." She turned to her dog, snapped her fingers and said, "Show them you're not scared, boy." Then, to everyone's horror, she lifted the leash and flung it forward in Judge Judy's direction. The shepherd lunged, a blur of motion and muscle. Gasps erupted. The bailiff moved instantly, grabbing the dog midair as papers flew and the audience rose to its feet. For a split second, time stopped. Judge Judy didn't move a muscle. Her expression was not fear, it was something far more dangerous: disbelief tempered by fury. "Get that animal under control now," the bailiff boomed, restraining the dog and pulling it to the side. Karen was still talking, still trying to justify herself. It was a gesture. I was just making a point. Her voice echoed desperately through the room. But the energy had shifted completely. The audience was no longer amused or annoyed, they were outraged. Gasps turned to murmurs. Someone in the back whispered, "She threw her dog at Judge Judy." The sentence sounded so absurd that it didn't seem real. Judge Judy rose slowly from her chair. When she spoke, her voice was low, controlled, and utterly terrifying. "Miss Blake, you just committed assault in my courtroom, with a living creature as your weapon." Karen's smirk finally collapsed into shock. The bailiff moved closer, hand hovering near his belt. Judy continued, "I will decide your fate in 30 seconds. Until then you will remain exactly where you are." The dog whimpered, its ears flattened, as if it too understood that something irreversible had just happened. Outside the courtroom, viewers would later call this, the moment entitlement met its master. Inside, the air was so charged with tension that nobody even blinked. The audience knew they were about to witness the kind of justice that only Judge Judy could deliver, the kind that doesn't just punish the crime but destroys the arrogance that fueled it. If you believe nobody, no matter how loud, rich, or entitled, should ever try to intimidate the law, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more moments when justice roars louder than arrogance. Because what Judge Judy did next didn't just restore order, it restored faith in justice itself. The courtroom was still humming with disbelief. The moment Karen Blake hurled that leash forward had already gone viral inside the studio audience's whispers. But Judge Judy wasn't just angry, she was calculating. She had seen arrogance before, but what Karen had done was something darker. It wasn't just defiance. It was the belief that she was untouchable, even in front of the law. "Sit down," Judge Judy commanded, her tone so sharp it sliced through the chatter like glass. Karen froze, still breathing hard, still muttering something about media setups and overreactions. The bailiff stepped forward and retrieved the German shepherd, now trembling near the bench. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The dog looked frightened, while the human who claimed to be its master still radiated fury. For a few seconds, Judy said nothing. The silence itself became a verdict. Cameras zoomed in on her face, the calm before detonation. When she finally spoke, her voice had the stillness of a warning siren before a storm. "You just tried to use that animal as a threat. You didn't lose control, Miss Blake. You surrendered it." Karen tried to laugh it off. "Oh please, I didn't throw him. I was just proving he's harmless." The words came out brittle like glass about to shatter. Judy didn't blink. "You proved something all right. You proved you're not fit to own a dog, or speak to another human being with basic respect." Karen's face turned red. "You can't talk to me like that. You don't even know who I am." A low murmur rippled through the audience. That single line, "You don't even know who I am," was the hallmark of every viral courtroom downfall. Judge Judy tilted her head. "You're correct. I don't know who you are. But after today the world will." The bailiff crossed his arms, watching her closely. Karen shifted uncomfortably. The leash, now confiscated, sat coiled on the bench beside the dog. The tension was unbearable. Judy gestured to the clerk. "Play the pre-recorded statements from the witnesses." A short video clip rolled on the courtroom monitor. Linda Morales, filmed in pretrial deposition, described the attack. "Her dog charged across the yard. My terrier never had a chance. I screamed, but she just stood there and said, 'That's what happens when you don't respect boundaries.'" The audience collectively exhaled in disbelief. Karen's smirk faltered. "She's exaggerating. That woman's always been jealous of me," she protested. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. "Jealous of what, Miss Blake?" Karen blinked. "Of my success. My store, my clients, my reputation." "Your reputation?" Judy interrupted. "Would that be the same reputation that comes with 3 citations from animal control for reckless handling, and a pending restraining order from your neighbor, Mrs. Walters?" Karen's jaw dropped. "That has nothing to do with this case." "Oh, it has everything to do with it," Judy said, voice like steel wrapped in silk. "Patterns of behavior matter. When you treat animals and people as tools for your own ego, the pattern always shows." The dog whimpered softly, its ears folded down. The sound somehow made the room even quieter. Judy's tone softened, not for Karen but for the creature beside her. "That dog isn't your weapon. He's a victim of your temper." Then, turning back to the defendant, "And I suspect this isn't the first time you've used him to intimidate someone." Karen crossed her arms tightly. "You can't prove that." "Watch me," Judy said. The clerk read from a statement. On 3 separate occasions Ms. Blake was warned by law enforcement after her dog was used to threaten delivery workers. No charges filed, but written warnings documented. Karen's expression flickered between panic and denial. They're lying. Those people were on my property. Judy's eyes glinted. Miss Blake, I've met hundreds of liars. You know how I recognize them? They keep talking after the truth is already obvious. The audience erupted in brief applause before Judy's glare silenced them again. The judge leaned forward, her tone surgical. Let me explain what's about to happen. You think this is entertainment? You think this is a debate? It's not. This is an evaluation of your character under pressure. And so far, it's failing spectacularly. Karen scoffed, looking around as if appealing to the cameras. You can't humiliate me like this on TV. I don't have to humiliate you, Judy replied. You're doing an exceptional job all by yourself. It was the kind of exchange that made this show legendary, every word dripping with precision, every insult doubling as a lesson. Judy didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She dismantled her opponents slowly, piece by piece, until arrogance had nowhere left to hide. She looked at the bailiff. Please remove the animal from this room. It's not his fault his owner behaves like a rabid one. Karen gasped. You can't take my dog. I just did, Judy said simply. The bailiff gently led the German shepherd out. The dog didn't resist. It followed willingly, tail low, glancing back once as if saying goodbye. That image burned into the audience's minds. A symbol of how control and cruelty always collapse under truth. When the door shut, Judy turned back to Karen. Now, Miss Blake. With your distraction removed, we can get to the truth. Karen's voice trembled, but her ego refused to break. You'll regret this. Judy smirked faintly. I rarely regret justice. The clock ticked. Cameras focused. Viewers around the world would later call this the minute of reckoning. It was the moment Judge Judy shifted from procedural to personal, where law turned into poetry. Here's what's going to happen next, Judy said. You're going to answer for your actions, one question at a time. And if I hear one more ounce of attitude, I'll remind you this courtroom isn't a playground. It's where pride comes to die. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. The audience sat frozen. Judy leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving the trembling woman in front of her. We're not done. Not even close. If you've ever seen arrogance collapse under truth, hit that subscribe button. Because what Judge Judy exposes next doesn't just end a case, it ends a lifetime of entitlement. The bailiff had barely finished leading the German shepherd out of the courtroom when Karen Blake's mask began to crack. The arrogance that once filled her posture drained away, replaced by something uglier, panic. She wasn't scared of Judge Judy yet, she was scared of being powerless. And for someone who'd spent her life intimidating others, that feeling was poison. She stood behind the defendant's table, her eyes darting toward the cameras, looking for a way out. The audience sensed it, the unraveling had begun. They leaned forward as if watching a car inch toward a cliff. Judge Judy sat perfectly still, chin resting on her hand, observing Karen with the kind of precision that turns silence into a weapon. Miss Blake, Judy began, her tone deceptively soft, why did you bring that dog here today? Karen blinked. Because he's part of this case. No, Judy said calmly, you brought him because you thought he'd make you look powerful. That's ridiculous, Karen shot back. He's my emotional support animal. Judy's eyebrows rose. Emotional support? You just used him as a projectile. The audience burst into quiet laughter, short, shocked, uncomfortable. Karen flushed red. It was an accident, she shouted. Judy raised a hand. Enough. You seem to think the rules here bend for you. They don't. This isn't your pet shop, Miss Blake. This is a court of law. And here, arrogance has a price. The camera zoomed in on Karen's face, jaw trembling, eyes wide, ego crumbling. She tried to talk, but Judy spoke right over her. You filed this lawsuit claiming you were emotionally damaged because your dog was called aggressive. But based on what I've just witnessed, the aggression didn't come from the dog, it came from you. For the first time, Karen had no comeback. The truth hit harder than any insult could. Judy flipped through the case file slowly, like a predator drawing out the suspense. You claimed your neighbor's dog started the fight. Yet every witness, everyone, says otherwise. Even animal control marked your shepherd as high risk. Tell me, Miss Blake, why should I believe you? Karen clenched her fists. Because people hate confident women, she snapped. If a man had a protective dog, nobody would complain. But when I do it, suddenly I'm dangerous. Judy didn't raise her voice, but the tone shifted, cutting, surgical. This isn't about confidence. It's about cruelty disguised as confidence. You don't protect, you provoke. Karen's mouth opened but no sound came out. Let me tell you something, Judy continued, leaning forward. I've met real strong women, mothers, veterans, teachers, women who fight for others, not against them. You weaponize strength. You think power means control. It doesn't. Power is restraint. The audience broke into soft applause. Even the bailiff, stone-faced as ever, looked satisfied. Karen turned away, whispering under her breath, "This is a setup. This is all fake." Judy caught it. "You think this is fake? You think the law bends to your tantrums? Try me." The silence that followed was unbearable. You could almost hear the hum of the cameras. Judy's eyes locked on hers. "In all my years I've seen liars, manipulators, thieves, but you're something else. You're someone who truly believes she's above consequence. And that belief, Miss Blake, is what's about to put you in chains." Karen took a step back, shaking her head. "You can't talk to me like that." "I can," Judy said evenly, "and I will. Because you crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed." Judy gestured toward the clerk. "Bring in the footage from the hallway incident." Karen froze. "What footage?" The monitor flickered on. Grainy security video filled the courtroom. Karen, earlier that morning, tugging harshly at her dog's leash while shouting at a producer. Her voice echoed, "If you people don't get me on first, I'll make a scene you'll never forget." The audience gasped. Karen's own words became her undoing. Judy let the silence linger before saying softly, "You were right about one thing. None of us will forget this." Karen tried to spin it. "I was joking. You're twisting everything I say." "No," Judy said, "you're finally hearing yourself the way the rest of the world does." The sound of Karen's breathing filled the microphone, uneven, desperate. "You can't just." Judy cut her off. "I can do whatever justice requires." For the first time Karen's body sagged. The performance ended. What stood in front of the nation now wasn't a proud trainer, or a confident businesswoman. It was a frightened woman who had built her entire identity around domination, and now had none left. The audience could see it, the quiver in her jaw, the shaking hands, the fading bravado. Judge Judy leaned back, her voice measured and final. "Let me tell you what's next. Your countersuit? Dismissed. Your credibility? Gone. But your accountability? That's just beginning." Karen whispered something too quiet to hear. "Speak up," Judy commanded. Karen's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "Then maybe," Judy said, "it's time you learned that meaning nothing doesn't undo doing everything." The words hit like a verdict. If you think accountability still matters, and if you believe silence after arrogance is the sweetest justice of all, drop a comment saying "Justice served." Because the next 30 seconds of this story will remind the entire world why Judge Judy's courtroom isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror. The moment Judge Judy uttered those last words, you could feel a shift in the air. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore, it was a reckoning. Karen Blake stood stiff as a statue, breathing hard, her eyes flicking toward the exit as if she could somehow escape what was coming. But Judge Judy's gaze locked her in place like a spotlight trapping guilt itself. "Miss Blake," Judy said, her voice low and steady, "you've mistaken mercy for weakness. That ends today." The audience went silent. You could hear the hum of the lights, the soft whir of a camera lens adjusting. Karen tried to recover some dignity. "You can't talk to me like I'm a criminal. I'm not one." Judy tilted her head. "You're right. You're worse. A criminal at least knows when they've crossed a line. You call it confidence." Karen started shaking her head violently, her voice climbing. "I just lost my temper. Everyone does." Judy's tone stayed flat. "People lose tempers. You lost control of your soul." The room was completely still. Even the bailiff, who'd seen everything, kept one hand near his belt, just in case. Judy turned toward the clerk's desk. "Read the statute for contempt and assault with a live animal." The clerk began to read, voice formal and heavy. Each word made Karen's face pale a little more. She'd come to court expecting applause, not arrest. When the clerk finished, Judy looked directly at her. "Do you understand what you've done here?" Karen stammered. I was angry. It wasn't serious. Nobody got hurt." "Nobody got hurt?" Judy repeated. "Look at your dog, Miss Blake. You turned a loyal animal into a prop for your pride. Look at Mrs. Morales. You turned her home into a place of fear. And this courtroom? You turned it into your stage." She paused, letting the weight of the words land. "Do you know what happens to performers when the show ends? Karen's voice was a whisper. What? They faced the reviews. And right now your audience has already written theirs. A murmur ran through the gallery. The audience wasn't angry anymore, they were waiting. They wanted to see justice in motion. Judy took one slow step down from her bench, standing now at the same level as Karen. The cameras zoomed in close, capturing the face of a woman who had spent decades teaching the world that the law could still bite. Miss Blake, Judy said, her eyes never leaving hers, in my courtroom arrogance ends one way. She nodded toward the bailiff. Cuff her. The sound of the handcuffs clicking echoed like a gavel strike. Gasps then applause filled the room. Karen's mouth dropped open in disbelief. You can't do this. This is a TV show. Judy's reply was instant. No, Miss Blake. This is real law. The cameras just make sure the world learns from it. The bailiff pulled her hands gently but firmly behind her back. Karen struggled once, then stopped when Judy spoke again. You thought you'd walk out of here with sympathy. Instead, you're walking out with a lesson. Karen tried one last defense. You're humiliating me. Judy shook her head. Humiliation is what happens when ego meets truth. I'm not doing this to shame you, I'm doing this to protect everyone else who thought cruelty was strength. The audience burst into applause again, unable to hold it back. 4 years they had watched Judge Judy handle liars, cheats, and manipulators. But this moment felt different. It wasn't entertainment. It was cleansing. As Karen stood cuffed, Judy turned to address the courtroom, not just the people inside but everyone watching from their living rooms. Let this be a reminder. The minute you believe your power makes you untouchable, you've already lost it. Justice isn't about noise, it's about balance. It always finds its way back. Karen's breathing grew heavy. Tears began to streak the mascara she'd applied so carefully that morning. Judy didn't soften. You will be remanded for evaluation and animal control review. Your neighbor's medical bills will be paid in full. And as for your business, well, I suspect the public will decide what happens next. The cameras caught every detail, the trembling lip, the reddened eyes, the silent nod that meant defeat. For a moment, Judy almost looked tired. Not angry tired. You know, Miss Blake, I've seen this too many times. People mistaking cruelty for courage. But courage isn't what happens when you shout the loudest, it's what happens when you choose to be decent when nobody's watching. Karen didn't answer. She couldn't. Judy turned back toward her bench, voice quieter now. Take her out. As the bailiff led Karen past the gallery, she whispered something no microphone caught. But the cameras didn't need the words, the look said everything. The same woman who once bragged she could control any animal was now being guided like one. When the door closed behind her, the audience sat frozen in awe. For a long time nobody spoke. Then Judge Judy turned toward Mrs. Morales, who sat trembling in quiet relief. Justice isn't about revenge, Judy said softly. It's about safety. You can go home knowing both are served. Mrs. Morales nodded through tears. The entire gallery stood and applauded, not for drama but for decency. Judge Judy gave one final look toward the camera, her eyes fierce but calm. To anyone watching, she said, remember, authority isn't loud. It's earned. If you believe respect for law still matters, tap that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. When the courtroom doors slammed behind Karen Blake, it was as if the entire room finally exhaled. The sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway echoed through the silence she had created. For a moment, Judge Judy simply sat there, motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty space where Karen had stood only minutes before. The audience wasn't cheering anymore. They were still contemplative. What they had just witnessed wasn't just a ruling, it was a revelation. Judy looked down at her bench and then toward the clerk. Please make sure that dog is placed in temporary care until animal control determines the proper adoption process. Her voice softened, the edge gone, replaced by something close to compassion. He's not the villain in this story. The clerk nodded. Yes, Your Honor. That single line, he's not the villain in this story, would later trend on social media, turning into a viral soundbite used in thousands of motivational edits and reaction videos. People didn't just replay the outburst, they replayed the moment after when Judy shifted from fury to grace. Because that was what her courtroom always stood for. Justice with a human spine. Mrs. Morales, the plaintiff, sat quietly, her small hands clasped together. She hadn't expected this ending. She had come for fairness, maybe an apology, but what she got was something deeper, validation. Judge Judy turned toward her. Mrs. Morales, you've shown remarkable restraint. Most people would have walked away angry or sought revenge. But you stood up, not just for your dog but for everyone too scared to speak up against arrogance. That matters. Mrs. Morales's voice trembled. I didn't want her punished, Your Honor. I just wanted her to stop. Judy gave a small, tired smile. That's what justice is supposed to do. It stops what shouldn't continue. Outside the courtroom, the world was already catching fire. The clip had hit the internet before the verdict had even been signed. Within an hour, hashtags like #JudgeJudyJustice and #KarenInChains were trending across social platforms. News outlets replayed the video on loop. The dog's leap, the bailiff's intercept, Judy's icy command, cuff her. It became the most replayed moment in courtroom television history. Memes, commentary videos, and reactions poured in from around the world. But beneath the humor and shock was something rawer, a sense of moral relief. People weren't cheering because a woman had been humiliated, they were cheering because for once, arrogance didn't win. By the next morning, Karen's pet store had lost nearly all its clients. Former customers came forward with stories of mistreated dogs, falsified training claims, and unpaid refunds. Local news outlets interviewed neighbors who described years of verbal abuse and intimidation. It wasn't the handcuffs that destroyed her image, it was the truth she'd spent years hiding, finally dragged into daylight. Meanwhile, the German Shepherd, named Max, became an unexpected symbol of redemption. Adopted weeks later by a retired Army veteran named Daniel Evans, Max was given a second chance at the kind of loyalty and love he'd never known. Photos of the pair soon went viral. Max resting peacefully beside a wheelchair, Evans smiling softly into the camera. The caption read, "He protects me now, but gently." That single image carried more justice than any courtroom ever could. Inside the network's editing room, producers debated whether to air the footage in full. Judge Judy herself intervened. "Air it," she said. "People need to see what happens when power turns cruel." When the episode finally aired, it broke every viewing record in the show's history. Viewers called it the 30 seconds that restored faith in authority. And when Judy sat down for her post-show interview, she didn't gloat. She simply said, "There's a difference between punishment and correction. The first breaks, the second rebuilds. My hope is that one day she understands the difference." A few weeks later, Judy received a letter. It was unsigned, written in shaky cursive. It read, "I've started volunteering at an animal shelter. Watching what I did on TV made me sick. You were right, I used power the wrong way. I'm sorry. For the dog, for the people I scared, and for myself." There was no return address, but Judy didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was from. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where she kept notes that reminded her why she never retired. Letters from people who had changed not because of punishment but because truth finally caught up to them. Weeks later, during a follow-up interview, Judy reflected on the incident. "That's the thing about justice," she said. "It's not about winning. It's about waking up. Sometimes that wake-up call sounds like a gavel. Sometimes it sounds like handcuffs. But if it leads to growth, it's worth the noise." That quote went viral again, stitched across motivational reels with orchestral music swelling in the background. But the real message wasn't about viral fame, it was about accountability. Every person watching at home could see themselves somewhere in that courtroom, as the proud one, the patient one, or the one finally saying, "Enough." By the time the credits rolled, the story wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about what Judge Judy had always represented, the invisible line between pride and principle, between cruelty and control. A line that, once crossed, doesn't just punish, it transforms. And as the lights dimmed in the studio that day, Judy whispered to herself, too quiet for the cameras to catch, "Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up." If you believe true justice isn't about revenge but about awakening, comment "Respect the law" below. Because sometimes the people who end up in chains are the very ones who needed freedom the most, and sometimes the courtroom isn't where arrogance dies. It's where humanity begins again. The courtroom had never seen anything quite like this moment. Karen Lawrence stood trembling with righteous indignation, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at Sarah Chen like a weapon, and the words that came out of her mouth would trigger the most explosive confrontation in Judge Judy's entire television career. "Your husband was a drug dealer, and everyone in this courtroom needs to know the truth about the kind of person you really are." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's face went white as shock rippled through her body. The audience erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that something unprecedented was unfolding. But the most dramatic transformation happened in Judge Judy herself. Her eyes, which had been carefully observing the proceedings with professional detachment, suddenly blazed with an intensity that made the entire courtroom feel like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. What Karen didn't know was that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. What she couldn't possibly understand was that Judge Judy had been waiting for this exact moment, had been setting a trap from the very first question, and had evidence in that manila folder on her desk that would not only destroy Karen's case but obliterate her entire existence. Before we show you the exact moment when Judge Judy delivered the reply that left Karen speechless for 38 seconds and shocked the entire nation, you need to understand how we got here. This wasn't just another petty dispute over property or money. This was about a woman who thought she could weaponize the legal system to destroy a grieving widow and her children. This was about greed so profound that it turned a neighbor into a predator who would slander a dead man to steal his family's home. And this was about justice delivered with such precision and fury that it would become the most viral courtroom moment in internet history, shared over 150 million times across every social media platform imaginable. If you believe that people who falsely accuse others deserve real consequences, smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe because what happens in the next several minutes will restore your faith that sometimes, just sometimes, the system works exactly as it should to protect the innocent and punish those who abuse it. Sarah Chin had never imagined she would end up in a courtroom fighting for her dignity and her children's future. 6 months ago, her world had been completely normal. She worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, pulling double shifts to help families through their worst moments. Her husband Michael had been a pharmaceutical sales representative for a Fortune 500 company, traveling the region to help doctors understand new medications that could save lives. They had 2 beautiful children, Emma who was 8 and Jason who was 6. They owned a modest but comfortable condo in a middle-class complex, nothing fancy but enough space for their family to build memories together. Then Michael died suddenly from a massive heart attack at age 36, collapsing in a hotel room during a business trip, leaving Sarah to navigate grief while trying to hold her shattered family together. The medical bills from Michael's final hospitalization, combined with funeral costs and the reality of losing half their household income, had created financial pressure that Sarah never anticipated. After 3 months of trying to manage mortgage payments on her nurse's salary alone, she made the difficult decision to sell their condo and move closer to her parents who could help with childcare while she rebuilt their lives. She listed the property for $425,000, which was fair market value according to 3 different real estate appraisals. The condo was well maintained in a good school district, and should have sold within a reasonable time frame. That's when Karen Lawrence entered her life like a hurricane of calculated cruelty. Karen lived 3 units down from Sarah and had been the self-appointed guardian of property values and neighborhood standards for the past 5 years. She served on the HOA board, ran the Neighborhood Watch program, and had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who violated her personal code of conduct. When Sarah's condo went on the market, Karen saw an opportunity. She approached Sarah with an offer of $280,000, nearly $150,000 below asking price. When Sarah politely declined, explaining that she needed to get fair value to secure her children's future, Karen's friendly facade disappeared completely. What followed was a systematic campaign of destruction designed to crater the property value and force Sarah into a desperate sale. Karen began spreading rumors throughout the complex and posting on neighborhood social media groups. She told potential buyers that the condo had structural problems, that the previous owner had been involved in suspicious activities, that there were noise complaints and pest infestations. None of it was true, but the whispers were enough to scare away 3 solid offers over the next 6 months. The rumors started small but grew more vicious with each passing week. Karen would conveniently be in the parking lot whenever potential buyers arrived for showings, striking up seemingly casual conversations that always ended with carefully planted seeds of doubt. She would mention how the previous owner kept odd hours and had a lot of visitors at strange times. She would talk about how pharmaceutical sales representatives sometimes had access to controlled substances and how you never really knew what people were doing behind closed doors. The implications were clear even if she never said anything directly actionable. She was painting Michael Chin as someone involved in illegal activities, and she was doing it with just enough plausible deniability that Sarah couldn't prove defamation in any conversation. But Karen's campaign went far beyond casual conversations in parking lots. She created posts in the neighborhood Facebook group asking if anyone else had noticed suspicious activity at Sarah's address. She filed noise complaints with the HO, even though Sarah's children were quiet and well-behaved. She reported code violations that didn't exist, forcing Sarah to pay for inspections that found nothing wrong. Every tactic was designed to create a paper trail that would make the property appear problematic to anyone doing due diligence. 3 different buyers put in strong offers only to withdraw after doing neighborhood research and finding Karen's carefully constructed web of innuendo and false reports. Each failed sale pushed Sarah closer to financial catastrophe as mortgage payments continued to drain her savings and foreclosure became an increasingly real threat. The breaking point came when Sarah received her 4th solid offer, this time from a young family who seemed perfect for the condo. They loved the space, appreciated the school district, and were pre-approved for financing at the asking price. Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, finally, she could move forward with her life and give her children the stability they desperately needed after losing their father. Then Karen struck with her most devastating blow yet. She approached the potential buyers directly in the parking lot and told them that Michael Chen had been under investigation for drug trafficking before his death, that the property might be subject to asset forfeiture, and that they should run away from this deal as fast as possible. The buyers, terrified by the prospect of legal complications, withdrew their offer that same evening. Sarah received the cancellation email while helping Emma with homework and broke down sobbing at the kitchen table while her children watched helplessly. That night, Sarah made the decision that would eventually lead her to Judge Judy's courtroom. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in defamation and explained everything that had happened over the past 8 months. The attorney investigated Karen's claims and found absolutely no evidence that Michael had ever been involved in anything illegal. His employment records were pristine, his tax returns showed legitimate income matching his salary, and law enforcement confirmed he had never been investigated for anything more serious than a speeding ticket from 2012. Armed with this documentation, Sarah filed a lawsuit against Karen Lawrence for defamation, intentional interference with a property sale, and infliction of emotional distress. She was asking for $100,000 in damages to cover the financial losses from the delayed sale, the emotional trauma inflicted on her family, and punitive damages to send a message that you cannot destroy someone's reputation with lies for personal gain. When Karen received the lawsuit, her response was not remorse or concern but outrage that this grieving widow had the audacity to challenge her. She hired an attorney and prepared a defense strategy that would paint Sarah as someone trying to hide her husband's criminal activities behind widow's tears and manufactured sympathy. Karen spent 3 weeks preparing for what she believed would be her moment of vindication. She compiled a binder full of neighborhood gossip, social media screenshots, and her own detailed notes about what she considered suspicious behavior. She practiced her testimony in front of her bathroom mirror, perfecting the concerned citizen routine she planned to perform. She selected a designer outfit that would project authority and respectability. She told her friends and neighbors that she was going to expose the truth about the Chen family on national television and finally prove that her concerns had been legitimate all along. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy's research team had been conducting their own investigation into both parties from the moment the case was assigned. They had pulled Michael Chen's complete background, including employment records, financial statements, criminal history checks, and interviews with former colleagues who described him as honest, hardworking, and completely above board in all his professional dealings. But more importantly, they had also pulled Karen Lawrence's background, and what they found was explosive. Judge Judy had reviewed all of this information personally the night before the courtroom taping, and she had made a decision. This case was going to be more than just a ruling on defamation. This was going to be a lesson about what happens when someone weaponizes false accusations to prey on the vulnerable. The trap was set, and Karen Lawrence was about to walk directly into it. The Judge Judy courtroom buzzed with its usual energy as cameras rolled and the audience settled into their seats for what the production schedule listed as a straightforward defamation case. Nobody in that room, except perhaps Judge Judy herself, had any idea they were about to witness television history. Sarah Chen entered first, wearing a simple navy blue dress that her sister had helped her pick out, clutching a folder of documents against her chest like a shield. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her position at the plaintiff's table, and even from a distance you could see the exhaustion in her eyes. This was a woman who had been ground down by months of harassment, who had cried herself to sleep worrying about her children's future, who was making one last desperate attempt to fight back against someone who had systematically destroyed her life. Karen Lawrence entered moments later with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her behavior. Her designer suit was perfectly tailored, her jewelry tastefully expensive, and her leather portfolio swung from her hand like a weapon she couldn't wait to deploy. She didn't even glance at Sarah as she passed, treating the grieving widow with the same dismissive indifference she had shown throughout their entire nightmare relationship. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with her signature no-nonsense approach, her voice cutting through the courtroom with authority that made everyone sit a little straighter. Mrs. Chin, you're suing Mrs. Lawrence for defamation and interference with your property sale. Tell me what happened. Sarah's opening testimony was quiet but steady as she explained the timeline of events. She described her husband's sudden death, the financial pressure that forced her to sell their home, and the initial listing of the property. Her voice cracked slightly when she explained how Karen had approached with a lowball offer and how everything changed after she declined. She presented evidence of the 3 failed sales, showing the timeline of when each buyer withdrew and what reasons they gave. She described the social media posts, the false HOA complaints, and the systematic campaign of rumors that had poisoned every potential sale. When she talked about her children asking why people said bad things about their daddy, several audience members wiped tears from their eyes. Judge Judy listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions that showed she had already done extensive research on the case. Then she turned her attention to Karen, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Lawrence, Mrs. Chin claims you deliberately spread false information about her late husband to damage her property sale. What do you have to say about these accusations? Karen's response was delivered with the practiced confidence of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Your Honor, I am simply a concerned neighbor who takes the safety and property values of our community seriously. When I noticed certain activities that seemed suspicious, I felt it was my duty to make sure potential buyers had all the information they needed to make informed decisions. This is about transparency and community standards, not about any personal vendetta. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed slightly, and experienced viewers recognized this as the first warning sign that Karen was walking into dangerous territory. What specific activities did you find suspicious, Mrs. Lawrence? Karen launched into her prepared speech about odd hours, frequent visitors, and the general sense that something wasn't quite right about Michael Chen's work in pharmaceuticals. She talked about her responsibility as an HOA board member and neighborhood watch captain to investigate potential problems before they became crises. She spoke with such conviction that someone who didn't know better might actually believe she had legitimate concerns rather than manufactured excuses to manipulate a property sale. Judge Judy let her talk, occasionally nodding, asking follow-up questions that seemed sympathetic to Karen's position. Karen grew more confident with each answer, clearly believing she was winning over the judge with her concerned citizen routine. Then Judge Judy asked the question that began Karen's unraveling. Mrs. Lawrence, did you make an offer to purchase Mrs. Chen's property yourself? Karen hesitated for just a moment before admitting that yes, she had made an offer, but it was a fair market offer based on her assessment of the property's true value. Judge Judy pressed further. And what was that offer? $280,000, Karen replied, her voice still confident. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair with that slight smile that regular viewers knew meant something devastating was coming. So you offered $145,000 below asking price, and when Mrs. Chin declined your offer, you began telling people her husband was involved in suspicious activities. Do you see how someone might think those two events were connected? Karen's face flushed red as she realized the trap closing around her, but her arrogance wouldn't let her back down. Your Honor, I resent the implication that my legitimate concerns about community safety had anything to do with a business transaction. Some of us actually care about more than just money. The condescension in Karen's voice was palpable, and it was about to trigger an explosion that would define the rest of her life. Judge Judy's expression hardened into something that made even the bailiff take notice. Mrs. Lawrence, you mentioned that pharmaceutical sales representatives sometimes have access to controlled substances. Can you elaborate on why you found that relevant to your concerns about Mr. Chin? Karen seized what she thought was an opportunity to justify her actions, launching into an explanation about how people in certain professions have opportunities for illegal activities and how the community deserved to know about potential risks. Her voice grew louder and more confident as she warmed to her theme, clearly believing she was making a compelling case. Judge Judy listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled in front of her face, and anyone who knew her recognized this posture as the calm before an absolute storm. When Karen finally finished her monologue, Judge Judy leaned forward with laser focus. So you're saying that because of Mr. Chen's profession, you had reasonable suspicion he might be involved in drug dealing? Karen nodded vigorously, missing the trap entirely. Exactly, Your Honor. Someone needed to ask the hard questions and do the difficult work of protecting our community. That's when Karen made the fatal mistake that would destroy everything. She turned slightly toward Sarah, her face twisted with self-righteous anger, and said the words that would echo across America. Your Honor, the man was clearly a drug dealer. She pointed directly at Sarah with accusatory fury. She knows it. Everyone knows it. Why else would a pharmaceutical rep have so much money and keep such odd hours? Someone needed to tell the truth about what was really going on in that condo. The courtroom exploded with gasps and shocked exclamations. Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Several audience members called out in protest before the bailiff gestured for silence. But the most dramatic reaction came from Judge Judy herself. Her face transformed from controlled professionalism into barely restrained fury, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority mixed with righteous anger that made the walls seem to vibrate. Mrs. Lawrence, you just made a very serious accusation on national television. Drug dealing is a federal felony. Do you understand the gravity of what you just said? Karen's confidence faltered slightly, but her arrogance pushed her forward. Yes, Your Honor, and I stand by it. Someone needed to tell the truth, and apparently I'm the only one with the courage to do it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Judge Judy sat back in her chair and opened the thick manila folder that had been sitting on her desk throughout the entire proceeding. She pulled out several documents and began reviewing them with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable level. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her earlier confidence beginning to crack around the edges as she realized something had fundamentally changed in the courtroom atmosphere. Judge Judy finally looked up from the documents, and her eyes locked onto Karen with the intensity of a predator who had been patiently waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Mrs. Lawrence, since you're so concerned about drug dealers and criminal activity, let's talk about truth. Let's talk about evidence. Let's talk about what real investigation reveals versus what malicious gossip creates. Judge Judy held up the first document. This is Michael Chen's complete employment history with Merck Pharmaceuticals. 12 years of exemplary service, multiple performance awards, and a spotless professional record. This is his criminal background check. Not a single arrest, not even a parking ticket beyond one speeding violation from 2012. These are his tax returns for the past 10 years, all showing legitimate income that matches exactly what a pharmaceutical sales representative at his level would earn. These are statements from his employer confirming that he was never under investigation, never suspected of any wrongdoing, and that all company medications were accounted for with zero discrepancies. Judge Judy's voice grew stronger with each piece of evidence, building toward something that everyone in the courtroom could feel coming. So Mrs. Lawrence, based on what possible evidence did you conclude that Michael Chen was a drug dealer? Karen's face had gone pale, but she tried desperately to maintain her composure. Your Honor, I had concerns based on what I observed and what seems suspicious to me as someone who knows this community. Judge Judy's response was swift and brutal. What you observed? You observed a man going to work and coming home. You observed a family living their lives. You observed nothing that would give any reasonable person cause for concern, and yet you felt entitled to destroy this widow's life with baseless accusations designed to manipulate her into selling her home to you at a fraction of its value. But here's what makes your behavior truly despicable, Mrs. Lawrence. Judge Judy pulled out another document from her folder, and Karen's eyes went wide with sudden recognition and fear. Since you're so concerned about people who illegally possess controlled substances, let me ask you about your own background. Karen's mouth opened but no sound came out as Judge Judy continued her methodical destruction. You have 2 DUI arrests on your record, one from 2016 and one from 2019. Both arrests involved prescription medications that you were not legally authorized to possess. The first arrest included charges for illegal possession of Xanax without a prescription. The second arrest included charges for illegal possession of Vicodin that you had obtained through fraudulent means from multiple doctors. You plea bargained both cases down to reduced charges, paid fines, and completed court-ordered substance abuse counseling. The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations as Karen's carefully constructed facade shattered completely. Her face cycled through expressions of shock, horror, and desperate panic as she realized that everything she had tried to hide was being exposed on national television in front of millions of viewers. Judge Judy was not finished with her systematic destruction of Karen's credibility and character. So let me understand this correctly, Mrs. Lawrence. You illegally possessed controlled substances on multiple occasions. You were arrested twice for driving under the influence of those illegally obtained medications. You manipulated the medical system to get prescription drugs you had no legitimate need for. And yet you felt qualified to stand in my courtroom and accuse a dead man who never broke a single law of being a drug dealer. The hypocrisy is so staggering that I'm almost impressed by your audacity. Karen tried desperately to speak, her voice coming out as a strangled whisper. Your Honor, that was in the past. I made mistakes and I paid for them. Those situations have nothing to do with my legitimate concerns about community safety. Judge Judy leaned forward with an expression of such withering contempt that Karen physically recoiled in her chair. Nothing to do with it? Everything about this case is connected to your character, your credibility, and your motivation. You saw a vulnerable widow trying to sell her home. You saw an opportunity to exploit her grief and financial desperation. When she refused your insulting lowball offer, you launched a calculated campaign to destroy her property value by slandering her dead husband with the very crimes you yourself have actually committed. That's not community concern, Mrs. Lawrence. That's predatory behavior wrapped in a thin veneer of civic responsibility. Judge Judy then asked the question that would break Karen completely and create the moment that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform. Mrs. Lawrence, did you make these accusations because you wanted to buy Mrs. Chen's property at a fraction of its value? The silence that followed was absolute. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Her hands began to tremble visibly as sweat formed on her forehead despite the air-conditioned courtroom. 15 seconds. 20 seconds. The cameras captured every moment of her mental collapse as she struggled to formulate any response that wouldn't be a complete admission of guilt. 25 seconds. 30 seconds. The audience sat frozen, barely breathing, watching this woman's entire life unravel in real time. 35 seconds. Finally, after 38 excruciating seconds that felt like an eternity, Karen whispered in a voice barely audible through her microphone. I thought if people knew about the concerns, the price would drop and I could help the community by buying it at a more reasonable price. The admission hung in the air like a confession at a murder trial. Judge Judy's response was immediate and devastating. So you just confessed on national television that you slandered a dead man to manipulate a widow into selling her home cheaply. You destroyed this woman's reputation, her children's sense of security, and their memory of their father for personal financial gain. Mrs. Lawrence, I have presided over thousands of cases in my career, and I can honestly say that you are one of the most manipulative, callous, and morally bankrupt individuals I have ever encountered in my courtroom. Judge Judy's verdict was swift and merciless. I am awarding Mrs. Chen $50,000 for defamation of her late husband's character. I am awarding her $30,000 for intentional interference with her property sale. I am awarding her $15,000 for emotional distress inflicted on her and her children. That is a total of $95,000 that you will pay immediately. Furthermore, I am recommending this case to the local prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges including defamation per se, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted extortion. The gavel came down with the finality of a guillotine blade, and Judge Judy delivered her final words with ice-cold fury. Get out of my courtroom, Mrs. Lawrence. And let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can destroy innocent people with lies for personal profit. Karen stumbled from her chair, tears streaming down her face, her expensive portfolio falling to the floor and scattering papers everywhere. She tried to speak, to protest, to somehow salvage something from this disaster, but no words would come. The audience erupted in sustained applause as Sarah Chen collapsed into grateful sobs, finally vindicated after 8 months of torture. The footage hit social media within minutes of airing and exploded across every platform imaginable. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed over 150 million times with hashtags like Justice for Sarah and Karma is Real trending for days. Karen's full name and face became synonymous with manipulative behavior and false accusations. The local prosecutor did indeed open a criminal investigation based on Judge Judy's recommendation, and 12 other families from Karen's neighborhood came forward with similar stories of harassment and manipulation. A class action lawsuit was filed within the week. Karen's position on the HOA board was terminated immediately, her real estate license was suspended pending investigation, and her husband filed for divorce after seeing the episode and realizing what kind of person he had been married to for 15 years. Meanwhile, Sarah's condo sold within 2 weeks for $445,000 to a family who specifically wanted to support her after seeing the case. A GoFundMe campaign raised an additional $200,000 for her children's education fund, and Sarah used part of the settlement to establish a scholarship in Michael's name for children who had lost parents. Judge Judy personally called Sarah after the episode aired to check on her family and offer continued support. The case became more than just a viral moment. It became a cultural touchstone about the real consequences of false accusations and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from predators who weaponize the legal system for personal gain. If you believe Judge Judy delivered perfect justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more moments where entitled people face the consequences they deserve. Share this video with anyone who needs to see that truth and integrity still matter. and that sometimes karma arrives with perfect timing in the form of America's toughest judge. The television courtroom had never witnessed such a moment of pure, unfiltered cruelty meeting its absolute reckoning. Patricia Henderson, a 44-year-old parking lot empire owner who had spent 4 years systematically targeting disabled veterans with fraudulent lawsuits, stood before Judge Judy Scheindlin with the kind of arrogance that could only come from someone who had never faced real consequences for exploiting America's heroes. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at the plaintiff as the words that would destroy her life forever spilled from her lips with breathtaking callousness. "Oh please, you can't even see where you parked. How convenient that you're blind when it's time to pay for damages you caused." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Patricia did something that would be replayed 250 million times across every social media platform in existence and turn her into the most despised woman in American history. She actually walked over to the blind veteran and waved her hand directly in front of his face, mocking his disability with a gesture so cruel that veterans in the courtroom gallery rose from their seats in fury. "Hello? Anyone home? Or is this all just an act to avoid responsibility?" The courtroom erupted into chaos as Judge Judy stood up from her bench for the first time in 25 years of television, her voice like thunder cutting through the pandemonium. "Sit down and step away from him right now." But what happened in the next 5 minutes would become the most emotionally powerful moment in courtroom history, a moment that would cost Patricia Henderson $95,000, 12 years of her freedom, and every shred of humanity she had left. But here's what makes this story absolutely insane. Patricia wasn't just mocking a blind veteran in a moment of poor judgment. She was the mastermind behind a calculated fraud operation that had specifically targeted 67 disabled veterans over 4 years, collecting $387,000 by deliberately creating fake damage claims against heroes who had lost limbs, eyesight, and cognitive function serving their country. She had kept detailed databases flagging veterans with disability income as high-value targets. She had positioned her parking lots strategically near VA medical centers to maximize her access to vulnerable victims. She had perfected a system of fabricating property damage and pressuring disabled veterans into settlements because she knew they lacked the resources and emotional capacity to fight back after everything they had already sacrificed. What Patricia didn't know as she stood there mocking Sergeant Robert Sullivan, a blind Army veteran who had lost both eyes to an IED explosion in Fallujah, was that Judge Judy had spent 2 full weeks coordinating with the FBI, the VA Office of Inspector General, and 39 of Patricia's previous victims to build a case so devastating it would trigger federal criminal investigations across multiple agencies. And what made this moment even more powerful was what happened after Patricia's cruel mockery. The blind veteran stood up with quiet dignity, placed his hand on his guide dog's head for support, and delivered a testimony about sacrifice and service that would make millions of Americans weep and remind the entire nation what true heroism looks like when faced with unspeakable cruelty. Before we show you the exact moment when this heartless parking lot owner mocked a blind veteran to his face and triggered Judge Judy's most unprecedented response in 4 decades of legal practice, make sure you hit that like button right now if you believe that people who exploit and disrespect disabled veterans deserve the harshest consequences that justice can deliver. Subscribe so you never miss these explosive courtroom moments where calculated cruelty meets the righteous fury of someone who spent her entire career defending people who cannot defend themselves. Trust me, what you're about to witness in the next 25 minutes will restore your faith that honor and dignity still matter in America, that some judges will break every protocol to stand up for those who served, and that karma has perfect aim when it comes to people who prey on heroes. What Judge Judy reveals about Patricia's systematic targeting of disabled veterans will shock you to your core and prove that some evil is so calculated it takes a legal mind with 40 years of experience to fully expose it to the light. And the moment when Sergeant Robert Sullivan delivers his testimony about losing his eyes in combat and rebuilding his entire life will break your heart and remind you why veterans deserve our eternal gratitude and protection from predators like Patricia Henderson. Patricia Henderson had walked into Judge Judy's courtroom on a Tuesday morning in downtown Los Angeles believing this would be her 44th successful payday from a disabled veteran too vulnerable to fight back against her fraudulent property damage claims. She owned Premium Park, a chain of 8 parking facilities strategically located in the Chicago area that generated $2.3 million in annual revenue from a combination of legitimate parking fees and her illegal fraud operation targeting veterans. She had started with a single lot inherited from her father in 2015 and had aggressively expanded by purchasing properties adjacent to VA medical centers, veteran services offices, and military family support centers. Her business model was simple and utterly ruthless. Create intentionally confusing parking signage with small fonts and contradictory regulations. Wait for veterans with visible disabilities or veteran license plates to park. Immediately tow their vehicles using inflated fees of $450 plus $75 per day storage. Then claim the veteran had damaged her property during reckless parking and file a lawsuit demanding anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000 in damages for curbs, poles, and parking equipment that were either already damaged or had been deliberately staged to appear damaged after the veteran left. Over 4 years, Patricia had filed 67 lawsuits using this exact pattern. 43 veterans had settled rather than face the trauma of litigation while dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, missing limbs, blindness, and the countless other wounds they carried from their service. She had collected $387,000 from these settlements, money stolen directly from disability benefits and VA compensation that veterans had earned through blood and sacrifice. She targeted disabled veterans specifically because her paralegal training had taught her that they represented perfect victims. They had steady income from disability payments, which meant they could pay settlements. They were less likely to fight back due to the cognitive and emotional challenges created by their service-connected injuries. Many suffered from PTSD and anxiety that made courtroom confrontations unbearable. And most devastatingly, Patricia had calculated that juries and judges would unconsciously doubt the testimony of people with cognitive injuries, blindness, or other disabilities that affected their ability to present evidence. She was a predator in the truest sense, someone who had identified the most vulnerable members of society and had built an entire criminal enterprise around exploiting their sacrifices for profit. Patricia's victims represented a cross-section of American military heroism destroyed by calculated greed. There was Marine Sergeant David Chin, who had lost his right leg to a roadside bomb in Helmand Province and settled for $8,000 because the stress of litigation was triggering panic attacks that left him unable to function. There was Army Specialist Jennifer Martinez, who had suffered a traumatic brain injury from a mortar attack in Iraq and paid $6,500 because her cognitive injuries made it impossible for her to track the complex legal arguments Patricia's attorney deployed against her. There was Navy Petty Officer Marcus Williams, who used a wheelchair after a training accident left him paralyzed from the waist down and settled for $11,000 because Patricia threatened to drag out the litigation until his adapted vehicle was sold at auction to pay her mounting storage fees. There was Air Force Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, who had lost both hands to an explosion while disarming ordnance in Afghanistan and paid $5,000 because she simply couldn't afford the $20,000 in legal fees it would cost to defend herself against Patricia's fraudulent claims. Each of these veterans had parked legally, had caused no damage, and had been systematically targeted because Patricia Henderson viewed their disabilities and their service as opportunities for profit rather than as badges of honor earned through sacrifice that most Americans could never comprehend. But Patricia had finally made the fatal mistake that would expose her entire operation and send her to federal prison for 12 years. She had targeted Sergeant Robert Sullivan, a 58-year-old retired Army veteran who had lost both eyes when his convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device in Fallujah in 2007. Bobby, as everyone called him, was different from Patricia's previous 43 victims in ways she never anticipated. He had spent 18 years since losing his sight rebuilding every aspect of his life with a determination that reflected his 22 years of military service. He had learned Braille, mastered mobility with a cane and his guide dog Zeus, adapted his home and vehicle with specialized technology, and most importantly had become a volunteer counselor at the VA Medical Center, helping other injured veterans navigate the devastating transition from injury to a new normal. Bobby had a support network that Patricia's previous victims lacked. He was connected to the Disabled American Veterans Legal Assistance Program. He had relationships with veterans advocacy groups who had been tracking Patricia's pattern for years but lacked the evidence to stop her. Most importantly, Bobby's guide dog Zeus wore a chest-mounted camera that recorded everything Bobby encountered during his daily navigation, a safety feature that had accidentally captured video evidence that would prove Patricia's fraud beyond any doubt. On March 15, 2024, Bobby had driven himself to a routine medical appointment at the VA hospital using the hand controls and audio guidance systems that allowed him to drive safely and legally despite his blindness. He had parked in Patricia's lot adjacent to the hospital, a facility that advertised itself as VA patient parking with rates of $5 per hour. Bobby had carefully navigated to the payment kiosk using Zeus as his guide, paid the $5 fee, placed the receipt on his dashboard exactly as the audio instructions specified, and made his way into the hospital for what he expected to be a 90-minute appointment. The video from Zeus's camera showed Bobby's meticulous parking process. It showed him using his hand controls to position the vehicle carefully between the lines. It showed him engaging the parking brake and performing his routine safety checks by feel. Most importantly, it showed the parking curb and the painted pole that Patricia would later claim Bobby had damaged, and the video proved beyond any doubt that this damage already existed before Bobby ever parked his vehicle. The curb had a 6-inch crack that had clearly been there for months based on the weathering and debris accumulated in the gap. The pole had scrapes and dents at heights that couldn't possibly have been caused by Bobby's sedan. The video timestamp showed Bobby parking at exactly 9:47 in the morning with the damage already present and visible. Bobby's appointment had run longer than expected due to wait times at the understaffed VA facility, and when he returned at 11:30, he found his vehicle had been towed. The notice left on the ground where his car had been parked claimed he had parked in an unauthorized area despite his valid receipt, and included notification that he was being sued for $8,500 in property damage. Patricia's documentation claimed Bobby had driven recklessly into the parking curb, breaking it and causing structural damage, and had also struck a painted pole causing extensive damage that required immediate repair. The towing company informed Bobby that his fees were $450 plus $75 per day storage, and that he would need to resolve the property damage lawsuit before his vehicle would be released. For most of Patricia's previous victims, this moment was when they broke. The combination of unexpected fees, fraudulent damage claims, legal threats, and the emotional exhaustion of fighting yet another battle after everything they had already endured in service to their country was simply too much. They settled because settling meant the nightmare would end, even though settlement meant allowing a predator to profit from their sacrifice. But Bobby Sullivan had something Patricia's previous victims didn't have. He had irrefutable video evidence from Zeus's camera showing that every element of Patricia's damage claim was fraudulent. He had a military attorney named Jake Morrison who worked pro bono through the Disabled American Veterans Legal Program and who had been investigating Patricia's operation for 2 years waiting for a case with enough evidence to expose her pattern. Most importantly, Bobby had a quality that 22 years of military service and 18 years of blindness had forged into an unbreakable core of his character. He had dignity, and he refused to let a con artist profit from mocking the sacrifice he had made for his country. Attorney Morrison reviewed Zeus's camera footage and immediately recognized they had something unprecedented. Crystal clear video evidence proving Patricia's damage claims were fabricated. Timestamps proving the damage existed before Bobby parked. Documentation of Bobby's careful parking process that demonstrated his competence and care despite his disability. Morrison went further, using legal discovery to subpoena Patricia's business records and uncovering the database she maintained flagging high-value targets who were veterans with steady disability income. He found internal communications where Patricia instructed her staff to create documentation for damage claims using language that proved premeditation and conspiracy. He contacted 39 of Patricia's previous victims and 39 of them provided sworn statements describing an identical pattern of fraudulent damage claims, pressure tactics and exploitation of their disabilities. Morrison then did something that would change everything. He compiled the evidence into a comprehensive package and contacted Judge Judy's producers, explaining that this wasn't just a parking dispute but a systematic fraud operation targeting disabled veterans that deserved national exposure to ensure Patricia would face both civil judgment and criminal prosecution. Judge Judy's research team spent 2 weeks verifying every detail Morrison provided. They contacted the FBI and the VA Office of Inspector General, both of whom confirmed they had been building cases against Patricia but needed a public platform to ensure political will for prosecution. They brought in forensic experts who analyzed Patricia's damage photos from dozens of cases and confirmed that the same pre-existing damage appeared in multiple supposedly separate incidents, proving the damage was being photographed and reused as evidence in fraudulent claims against different veterans. They verified Zeus's camera footage with experts from guide dog training organizations who confirmed the technology's reliability and the authenticity of the timestamps. When Judge Judy finished her investigation, she knew she wasn't just taking a case. She was going to war for every veteran Patricia had exploited, and she was going to make sure this predator never harmed another hero again. Judge Judy Scheindlin had handled thousands of cases involving veterans during her 40 years in law, first as a family court judge in New York for 25 years and then during her television career that had made her America's most trusted arbiter of justice. Her own father had been a World War II veteran who lost his hearing from artillery fire and spent the rest of his life dealing with the invisible wounds that civilians never understood. She had developed a special reverence for military service and an absolute intolerance for anyone who exploited or disrespected those who had worn the uniform. When her research team presented her with the evidence of Patricia Henderson's systematic targeting of disabled veterans, something shifted in Judge Judy that even her longtime producers had never witnessed before. This wasn't just another fraud case to be adjudicated with her typical sharp efficiency. This was personal in a way that transcended professional boundaries, and she was prepared to break protocols that she had maintained for decades if that's what it took to deliver justice and give these veterans the dignity they deserved. She spent hours reviewing Zeus's camera footage, watching Bobby Sullivan navigate his world with careful precision and obvious competence despite his blindness. She read every single statement from the 39 veterans who had settled with Patricia, their words describing not just financial loss but the deep psychological wounds of being targeted because of disabilities they had earned serving their country. She studied Patricia's database with its clinical notations about targeting veterans with cognitive injuries, PTSD, and physical disabilities, the cold calculation of a predator who had systematized the exploitation of vulnerability. Judge Judy coordinated directly with federal investigators to ensure her televised ruling would provide the foundation for criminal prosecution. She worked with veterans advocacy organizations to ensure Bobby would have support resources regardless of the case outcome. She even reached out personally to several of Patricia's previous victims to let them know that their suffering had not been invisible and that justice was coming even if it arrived years too late for them. By the time Patricia Henderson walked into Judge Judy's courtroom with her arrogant confidence and her leather portfolio full of fabricated evidence, she had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been constructed with the precision of a military operation. Every question Judge Judy would ask had been designed to let Patricia reveal her cruelty before the hammer of justice fell. Every piece of evidence had been authenticated and verified to survive any appeal. Every federal agency that would need to prosecute Patricia criminally was standing by ready to act the moment this episode aired. Patricia thought she was about to intimidate another disabled veteran into submission. She was actually about to face the consequences for 4 years of systematic evil, and those consequences would be delivered by a judge who had spent weeks ensuring that justice would be both swift and absolutely devastating. The courtroom was packed with an unusual crowd that Tuesday morning. Veterans advocacy groups had gotten word through their networks that something significant was happening, and the gallery was filled with men and women wearing Purple Heart caps, disabled American veterans shirts, and the unmistakable bearing of people who had served. Patricia noticed the veteran presence as she entered but dismissed it as Bobby's attempt to generate sympathy through theatrical support. What she failed to understand was that these veterans weren't there as props. They were there as witnesses to one of their own finally getting justice, and their presence transformed the courtroom from a television set into something closer to a military tribunal where a predator who had targeted their brothers and sisters would finally be held accountable. Bobby sat at the plaintiff's table with Zeus lying calmly at his feet, his wife Sarah beside him holding his hand, his dress uniform displaying the Purple Heart and Bronze Star he had earned in 22 years of service. He wore dark glasses that couldn't hide the scars around his eyes from the explosion that had taken his sight, physical reminders of a sacrifice that most people could never comprehend. Despite his blindness, Bobby sat with the straight-backed posture of a soldier, projecting quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Patricia's aggressive confidence. Patricia strutted to the defendant's table like someone who had never lost at anything, her designer suit carefully chosen to project success and authority, her expensive briefcase clutched like a weapon she was eager to deploy. She had prepared for this exactly as she had prepared for her previous 43 victories against disabled veterans. She had professional photographs of damage that she would claim Bobby caused. She had repair estimates from contractors who were part of her fraud network. She had a witness statement from her parking lot attendant who would testify to whatever Patricia needed him to say. She had crafted a narrative that painted Bobby as a reckless driver whose disability made him a danger on the road and whose damage to her property demanded compensation regardless of whatever sympathy his military service might generate. Patricia had practiced her testimony in front of mirrors, perfecting the tone of reasonable business owner reluctantly forced to seek compensation from someone whose limitations had caused legitimate damage. She expected Judge Judy to be tough but fair, to hear both sides, and ultimately to recognize that property damage required payment regardless of who caused it. She had no idea that Judge Judy had already made her decision before the first word was spoken, and that decision was to expose Patricia's fraud so thoroughly that federal prosecutors would have everything they needed to send her to prison for over a decade. Judge Judy entered the courtroom and the bailiff called everyone to order with the usual formality, but anyone paying attention could see something different in the judge's expression as she took her seat at the bench. There was a hardness in her eyes that veteran viewers recognized as the look she reserved for people who had committed offenses that transcended ordinary legal disputes. She looked at Bobby first, and her expression softened with unmistakable respect before hardening again as she turned her attention to Patricia. The contrast was deliberate and unmistakable. On one side sat a man who had given everything including his eyesight in service to his country and had spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding his life with dignity and purpose. On the other side sat a woman who had built a criminal enterprise specifically targeting people like Bobby because she viewed their sacrifices as opportunities for profit. Judge Judy knew exactly how this case would end, but she also knew the journey to that ending needed to happen in a way that would resonate beyond this courtroom and remind America what values truly mattered when tested by cruelty and greed. The opening moments followed standard procedure as Judge Judy reviewed the basic facts from the case file, her voice carrying its usual authority as she established the framework of the dispute. Sergeant Robert Sullivan was suing to recover his vehicle and challenging a property damage claim of $8,500 filed by Patricia Henderson, who owned the parking facility where his vehicle had been towed. Patricia was counter-suing for the property damage and demanding payment before releasing the vehicle. On the surface it appeared to be a straightforward property dispute with competing claims about who was responsible for damage to parking facility infrastructure. But Judge Judy had no intention of maintaining that surface appearance for long. She turned to Bobby first, and her voice carried a warmth that made it clear she had already formed an opinion about his character and credibility. "Sergeant Sullivan, thank you for your service to our country. Please tell me what happened on March 15th when you parked at Ms. Henderson's facility." The simple courtesy of thanking Bobby for his service was deliberate, a signal to everyone watching that she viewed his veteran status not as irrelevant detail but as fundamental context for understanding everything that would follow. Bobby's response was measured and precise, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying his words as he described parking legally, paying the required fee, and returning from his VA medical appointment to find his vehicle had been towed and he was being accused of damage he knew he couldn't have caused. Bobby explained his driving adaptive technology, the hand controls and audio guidance systems that allowed him to operate a vehicle safely and legally despite his blindness. He described his meticulous parking process, using his guide dog Zeus for navigation and taking extra time to ensure he was positioned correctly within the parking space boundaries. He spoke about his perfect driving record over 18 years since losing his sight, a record that reflected his careful attention to safety and his refusal to let his disability prevent him from maintaining independence and mobility. Most importantly, Bobby explained that Zeus wore a camera harness that recorded his daily navigation for safety purposes, and that this camera had captured his entire parking process, including clear footage showing that the damage Patricia claimed he caused was already present when he arrived. Judge Judy asked to see the footage, and the courtroom screens lit up with crystal clear video from Zeus's perspective as Bobby parked. The video was damning in its clarity. It showed Bobby's careful approach to the parking space. It showed the parking curb with a 6-inch crack already present and weathered. It showed the painted pole with scrapes and dents at multiple heights that couldn't possibly have been caused by Bobby's vehicle. Most importantly, it showed the timestamp of 9:47 a.m., and Judge Judy's research team had already verified that Patricia's damage photos had been taken at 10:15 a.m., 30 minutes after Bobby had already left for his appointment inside the hospital. Judge Judy allowed the courtroom to absorb the video evidence in silence for a moment, letting the timestamp and the clear documentation of pre-existing damage speak for itself before she turned her attention to Patricia with an expression that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Ms. Henderson, I've just watched video evidence showing that the damage you claim Sergeant Sullivan caused was already present when he parked. Your damage photos have a timestamp 30 minutes after he had already walked away from his vehicle. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Patricia's response revealed the depth of her arrogance and her fundamental miscalculation about who she was dealing with in Judge Judy's courtroom. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that video doesn't prove anything definitive. Cameras can malfunction. Timestamps can be wrong. And frankly, how would Sergeant Sullivan even know if there was existing damage? He's blind." The last sentence hung in the air like poison gas, and Judge Judy's eyebrows raised in that expression that longtime viewers knew meant someone had just made a catastrophic mistake. "So your defense is that because Sergeant Sullivan is blind, his evidence is less credible than your photographs that were taken after he left the scene?" Patricia, sensing she was losing ground but unable to stop herself from doubling down, pressed forward with her prepared narrative. "I'm simply saying that someone who cannot see cannot accurately testify about visual details like whether damage existed or not. My documentation is clear and my witness will testify that he observed Sergeant Sullivan's vehicle strike the curb and the pole." Judge Judy leaned back in her chair with that slight smile that meant she was about to dismantle someone's argument piece by piece, and her voice took on the surgical precision that had made her famous for exposing lies on national television. "Let's talk about your witness, Ms. Henderson. Your parking lot attendant who coincidentally works for you and who has provided similar testimony, and let me check my notes here, 42 previous lawsuits you've filed against other customers. Patricia's face flickered with the first sign of genuine concern as she realized Judge Judy had done far more research than she had anticipated. Those are separate cases, Your Honor. The fact that I've had to pursue legal action against multiple people who damaged my property doesn't invalidate the legitimacy of each individual claim. Judge Judy opened the thick folder on her bench, the same folder that had been sitting there since the beginning but which Patricia had assumed was just standard case documentation. On the contrary, Ms. Henderson, it establishes a pattern. And patterns are very interesting to federal investigators. The word federal hit Patricia like a physical blow, and her confident posture wavered for just a moment before she tried to recover her composure. Judge Judy wasn't finished. I have statements here from 39 veterans, Ms. Henderson. 39 separate individuals who describe a nearly identical pattern to what Sergeant Sullivan experienced. Towing within 30 minutes of parking. Immediate damage claims for pre-existing issues. Pressure to settle for amounts between $5,000 and $15,000. And do you know what all 39 of these individuals have in common? They're all disabled veterans. They all park near VA medical facilities. And they all have disabilities that you calculated would make them less likely to fight back. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Judy laid out the pattern with devastating clarity, each sentence landing like an accusation in a criminal trial rather than a civil dispute. Patricia tried to mount a defense, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence and taken on a defensive edge that made her sound guilty even before Judge Judy revealed the truly damning evidence. Your Honor, I run 8 parking facilities. I deal with hundreds of customers daily. If some of them happen to be veterans, that's simply demographics, not targeting. Judge Judy's response was swift and merciless. Really? Then explain this. She held up a document that made Patricia's face go white. This is a printout from your business database, Ms. Henderson. A database where you flag certain customers as high-value targets. And according to the notations here, high-value targets are defined as veterans with steady disability income who are dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, or physical disabilities that make litigation challenging. You have notes next to names describing their vulnerabilities. Marine with one leg, unlikely to want courtroom stress. Army veteran with TBI, confusion makes defense difficult. Navy veteran in wheelchair, mobility issues complicate evidence gathering. You didn't just happen to sue veterans, Ms. Henderson. You systematically hunted them because you viewed their sacrifices and their disabilities as opportunities for profit. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and several of the veterans in the gallery made sounds of disgust and anger that the bailiff had to quiet with hand gestures. Patricia's attorney put his head in his hands, recognizing that his client had been caught in something far worse than a simple fraud case. Patricia herself seemed frozen, unable to formulate a response to evidence that proved premeditation and calculation beyond any reasonable doubt. Judge Judy pressed her advantage with the relentlessness of a prosecutor who knew she had an airtight case. But it gets worse, Ms. Henderson. I have forensic analysis of your damage photographs from 17 different lawsuits. Do you know what the experts found? The same damage appears in multiple supposedly separate incidents. The same cracked curb. The same dented pole. The same scratched payment kiosk. You've been photographing pre-existing damage and fraudulently claiming that different customers caused it on different occasions. You're not running a parking business, Ms. Henderson. You're running a criminal enterprise that specifically targets disabled veterans, and I have evidence that proves it beyond any doubt. Patricia's face had gone from white to red as the full scope of her exposure became clear, and her voice when she finally spoke was shrill with desperation. This is outrageous. You're making me sound like some kind of monster when all I've done is try to protect my property and run a legitimate business. That's when Patricia made the decision that would cost her everything and cement her place in history as one of the most despised people ever to appear on national television. She turned away from Judge Judy and looked directly at Bobby Sullivan, and her face twisted with contempt that revealed the true darkness of her character. Oh, please, Your Honor. This whole disabled veteran act is getting old. He parks wherever he wants, does whatever he wants, and when there are consequences, everyone's supposed to feel sorry for him because he's blind? The word blind dripped with sarcasm and mockery that made several people in the courtroom gasp audibly. Judge Judy's voice cut through the rising murmur like a blade. Ms. Henderson, I strongly suggest you stop talking right now. But Patricia was beyond reason, beyond calculation, beyond any ability to recognize that she was destroying herself with every word. She actually stood up and turned to face Bobby directly, her voice rising with indignation. You can't even see where you parked. How convenient that you're blind when it's time to pay for damages you caused. And then Patricia Henderson did something so unconscionable, so deliberately cruel, that it would be replayed 250 million times and make her the target of death threats for years to come. She walked over to where Bobby sat and waved her hand directly in front of his face, her voice mocking and theatrical. Hello? Anyone home? Or is this all just an act to avoid responsibility? The courtroom exploded into chaos. Veterans in the gallery surged to their feet shouting. Judge Judy stood up from her bench, something she had never done in 25 years of television. Her voice, when it came, carried the full weight of her fury and authority. Sit down and step away from him right now. The bailiff moved quickly to position himself between Patricia and Bobby, though Bobby himself hadn't moved or reacted to the mockery beyond a slight tightening of his jaw. Sarah, Bobby's wife, had tears streaming down her face, torn between rage at Patricia's cruelty and pride in her husband's dignity under assault. Patricia seemed to finally understand that she had crossed a line from which there was no return, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. What? I'm just proving a point that he can't possibly know what happened when he can't see. Judge Judy's voice was ice cold and absolutely final. You just mocked a disabled veteran who lost his eyes serving this country. On national television. With millions watching. Do you have any idea what you've just done to yourself? The question hung in the air as Patricia slowly returned to her seat, her face showing the first real understanding that she had just committed an unforgivable act in front of an audience that would never forget and would never forgive. In the silence that followed, Bobby Sullivan slowly stood up, his hand finding Zeus's head for support and orientation. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the courtroom with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to Patricia's cruelty. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Judy's expression softened immediately as she looked at the veteran standing before her with his guide dog at his side and his shoulders squared despite everything he had just endured. Sergeant Sullivan, you may speak. Bobby turned his body in the direction of Patricia's voice, though his dark glasses meant he couldn't see her face, and he began to deliver the testimony that would break the hearts of millions of Americans and remind a nation what sacrifice truly meant when measured against the petty cruelty of those who had never given anything beyond their own comfort and profit. Bobby Sullivan's voice carried the weight of 22 years of military service and 18 years of living in darkness when he addressed Patricia Henderson and the courtroom full of people watching him stand with quiet dignity in the face of unspeakable mockery. Ma'am, I lost my eyes in Fallujah when my convoy hit an improvised explosive device on November 7, 2007. I was 36 years old. I had been married to Sarah for 8 years. My daughter Emily was 5 years old and my son Michael was 3. The last thing I ever saw was my best friend, Corporal James Martinez, bleeding out in the seat next to me while I tried to put pressure on wounds I couldn't reach because my hands wouldn't work right and my face was on fire. Bobby's voice broke slightly on the word fire, but he steadied himself and continued with the testimony that would be played at veteran events and shared across social media millions of times. I woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany and the doctors told me I would never see again. They told me both my eyes had been destroyed by shrapnel and the blast pressure. They told me my life as I knew it was over and I would have to learn everything again. How to walk without sight. How to navigate without vision. How to be a husband to a wife I could no longer see smile. How to be a father to children whose faces I would never watch grow and change. I spent 2 years at Walter Reed learning mobility skills, learning Braille, learning adaptive technology, learning to drive with hand controls and audio guidance systems. My wife learned to be my eyes and describe the world I could no longer see. My children grew up with a father who couldn't play catch, couldn't help with homework that required sight, couldn't see their school plays or watch them learn to ride bikes. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of people crying. Veterans and civilians alike moved beyond words by Bobby's testimony. He continued with devastating simplicity. I don't need sympathy. I don't need pity. I made peace with my blindness years ago. I built a good life. I volunteer at the VA helping other injured veterans adjust to their disabilities. I've been driving safely for 18 years with 0 accidents because I take my responsibility seriously and I use every tool and technology available to compensate for what I lost. I have a guide dog who I trust with my life and who has never let me down. I have a wife who has stood by me through everything and children who grew into adults who are proud of their father's service despite the sacrifices our family made. But what I will not accept, what no veteran should ever have to accept, is being mocked for the disabilities we earned serving our country. Bobby's voice grew stronger, filling with an emotion that transcended anger and touched something deeper about honor and dignity and the debt a nation owes to those who sacrifice. I would give anything to see again, ma'am. I would give anything to watch my grandchildren's faces when they laugh. I would give anything to see a sunset with my wife. I would give anything to look at a photograph of my parents before they passed away. But I can't. And people like you mock that sacrifice as if losing my eyes was something I chose, as if my blindness is an act I perform to avoid responsibility rather than a permanent consequence of putting my life on the line for a country that includes people like you who exploit people like me. Bobby turned back toward Judge Judy, tears visible on his cheeks beneath his dark glasses, his voice steady despite the emotion. Your Honor, I don't want her money. I never wanted to be here fighting over $8,000. What I want is for her to stop doing this to other veterans who don't have the resources I have to fight back. I want her to face consequences for deliberately targeting disabled veterans because she thinks our sacrifices make us easy victims. I want every veteran she exploited to get their money back and their dignity restored. And I want Americans watching this to remember that when veterans come home with injuries, we deserve respect and protection, not predators who view our disabilities as profit opportunities. The silence that followed Bobby's testimony was profound and absolute, the kind of silence that occurs when everyone in a room understands they have witnessed something that transcends entertainment or legal proceedings and touches the fundamental values that define a civilization. Judge Judy sat motionless for a long moment, and when she finally stood up from her bench, veterans in the gallery instinctively came to attention, recognizing that something unprecedented was about to happen. Judge Judy Scheindlin had maintained strict professional boundaries for 40 years in courtrooms, first in New York family court and then in television, believing that judges must remain emotionally distant to render fair justice. But Bobby Sullivan's testimony had broken through those boundaries and reminded her that sometimes justice requires more than legal rulings. Sometimes it requires bearing witness to sacrifice and offering recognition that transcends judicial procedure. She stepped down from her bench, something she had never done in 25 years of her television show, and walked slowly across the courtroom to where Bobby stood with Zeus at his side. Sergeant Sullivan, she said quietly, reaching for his hand and guiding it to meet hers in a proper handshake. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Bobby's face registered surprise at the physical contact, at the judge leaving her bench to personally acknowledge him, and his military bearing returned as he straightened his shoulders and shook her hand firmly. The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for 3 full minutes, veterans and civilians standing together to honor a moment of recognition and respect that had been 18 years overdue. Judge Judy returned to her bench with tears visible in her eyes for the first time in her television career, and when she spoke again her voice carried the full weight of judicial authority combined with personal conviction that this verdict would be absolute and devastating. Ms. Henderson, let me be very clear about what you've done and what will happen to you. You have systematically targeted disabled veterans for 4 years. You have collected $387,000 through fraudulent property damage claims against heroes who sacrificed parts of their bodies and minds serving this country. You kept databases tracking their vulnerabilities. You positioned your businesses near VA facilities to maximize access to victims. You fabricated evidence, staged damage scenes, and pressured settlement from people dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, missing limbs, and blindness. And when confronted with irrefutable evidence of your fraud, you mocked a blind veteran to his face on national television. The judgment in this case is as follows. You will immediately return Sergeant Sullivan's vehicle with 0 storage fees. You will pay him $8,500 to compensate for the fraudulent damage claim. You will pay him an additional $25,000 in punitive damages for targeting him specifically because of his disability. You will pay $15,000 to cover his legal fees. You will pay $1,000 per day for every day you've held his vehicle unlawfully. Total judgment against you is $95,000 payable immediately. Judge Judy's voice grew even harder as she delivered the portion of the ruling that would ensure criminal consequences. Furthermore, I am ordering you to contact all 39 veterans who settled with you previously and refund every penny of the $387,000 you stole from them through fraud. I am referring this case to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for wire fraud charges based on your interstate fraud scheme. I am referring this case to the VA Office of Inspector General for fraud against veterans. I am referring this case to the Internal Revenue Service for tax evasion on $387,000 in unreported income. And I am providing every piece of evidence to federal prosecutors to ensure you face criminal charges for your systematic targeting of disabled veterans. Judge Judy looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions who would watch this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when cruelty meets accountability. Ms. Henderson thought she could exploit veterans forever because each victim existed in isolation. She thought she could mock a blind veteran and face no consequences. She was wrong. The gavel came down with finality. "Get out of my courtroom." Patricia Henderson stumbled from her chair, destroyed and sobbing, understanding too late that she had just lost everything in front of the largest audience of her life. But before she could leave, Bobby Sullivan did something that would become the second most viral moment from this case. He stood at attention, found Zeus's harness for orientation, and rendered a crisp military salute in Judge Judy's direction. The gesture was pure military protocol, a soldier showing respect to authority that had delivered justice and honored his service. Judge Judy, who had never returned a salute in her life and had no military service that entitled her to receive one, understood that this moment transcended protocol. She stood and returned Bobby's salute, a civilian judge honoring a veteran's sacrifice with a gesture that would be replayed alongside her unprecedented walk from the bench as proof that some moments require breaking every rule to honor values that matter more than procedure. Within 2 hours, the clip had reached 50 million views. Within 24 hours, 250 million people had watched Patricia Henderson mock a blind veteran and watched Judge Judy deliver justice with unprecedented force. The hashtag #RespectOurBlindVeterans Veterans reached 8.4 million tweets. Bobby's testimony was shared in veteran groups, played at military ceremonies, and used in training about the ongoing need to protect disabled veterans from exploitation. 6 months later, Patricia Henderson was convicted on 39 counts of fraud and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with orders to pay full restitution that would follow her for life. Bobby Sullivan donated $2 million from a GoFundMe campaign to blind veteran organizations and became a national spokesman for disabled veteran rights. If you believe Patricia Henderson got exactly what she deserved for mocking a blind veteran, smash that like button right now. Comment "Respect Our Veterans" to honor heroes like Sergeant Bobby Sullivan who gave everything for our freedom. Subscribe so you never miss moments where cruelty meets perfect justice. Share this with every veteran you know. Remember, Sergeant Sullivan gave his eyes for our country. The least we can do is defend his dignity. In Judge Judy's courtroom, disrespecting veterans comes with consequences. Thanks for watching and God bless our veterans.